Shadows of Trust, a tale of love, betrayal, and redemption. The soft hum of a summer evening lingered in the air as I stood at the edge of my backyard, staring at the life I had spent years cultivating. It was a life that, from the outside, gleamed with perfection. A loving husband, two beautiful children, a cozy home nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood, and a family so tightly knit it felt like an unbreakable tapestry. I had always believed these were the cornerstones of my existence, the unshakable pillars that held me upright through the chaos of daily life. But beneath the polished surface of this idyllic world, something had begun to stir, a quiet, persistent ache that wormed its way into my heart like roots breaking through concrete. I'd never imagined I'd find myself here, teetering on the brink of a betrayal that would unravel everything I held dear. My name is Sarah, not that it matters much now. And this is the story of how I let a fleeting connection turn into a storm that threatened to destroy the life I had so carefully built. It all started innocently enough, as these things often do. It was one of those lazy summer afternoons that stretch endlessly into dusk, the kind where the sun hangs low in the sky, painting everything in hues of gold and lavender. Our family had gathered at my in-laws' sprawling farmhouse, an annual tradition that brought together cousins, aunts, uncles, and a swarm of children running wild across the lawn. The air was thick with the scent of barbecue and freshly cut grass, laughter echoing over the hum of cicadas. These gatherings were the heartbeat of our family, a ritual that tied us together beyond blood, weaving a bond forged by shared holidays, inside jokes, and an unspoken promise that we'd always be there for one another. Among the familiar faces was Ethan, my husband Daniel's cousin. He'd always been around, a quiet figure hovering on the edges of our chaotic family events. I'd known him since we were kids, back when we'd chase fireflies together or sit through endless Thanksgiving dinners at the same crowded table, but to me he'd always been a background character, someone I nodded to politely, exchanged small talk with, and then forgot about as soon as the conversation ended. Ethan was the kind of person who seemed content to blend into the shadows, his reserved nature a stark contrast to the boisterous energy of the rest of us. That summer, though, something shifted. Maybe it was the way the light caught his eyes as he sat on the porch that evening, or maybe it was me, who I'd become after years of routine had dulled the edges of my spirit. I'd stepped outside to escape the noise of the party, craving a moment of stillness. And there he was, sitting alone with a glass of iced tea in hand. The sky had softened into a delicate purple, and the world felt hushed, as if it were holding its breath. "Hey," I said, offering a small smile as I settled onto the bench beside him. "Hey," he replied, his voice low and steady, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Our conversation started as it always had, simple, safe. We talked about the weather, the kids tearing through the yard, the latest family gossip about Aunt Linda's new boyfriend. But then, somewhere between the mundane and the familiar, the air between us changed. He asked me a question, something trivial, like how I'd been holding up with work, and I answered with more honesty than I'd intended. "Tired," I admitted, letting out a small laugh that didn't quite reach my eyes. It's just the same thing, day after day, you know? He nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon. I get it. Sometimes it feels like you're just drifting, like you're waiting for something to wake you up. His words hit me harder than I expected, a quiet truth that echoed the restlessness I'd been trying to ignore. We kept talking, the conversation flowing effortlessly into deeper waters. His dreams of traveling the world, my forgotten passion for painting, the way life had a habit of burying the things that once made us feel alive. For the first time in years I felt seen, not as a wife, a mother, or a cog in the family machine, but as Sarah, the woman I'd been before responsibility had rewritten my story. It wasn't love, not then, not yet, but it was something, a flicker of possibility, a tremor in the stillness of my heart, and it scared me more than I could admit. In the days that followed, I tried to shove that evening into a box and lock it away. I threw myself into my routine, making breakfast for the kids, kissing Daniel goodbye as he headed to work, folding laundry late into the night. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting moment of connection that didn't deserve the space it was taking up in my mind. After all, I had a good life. Daniel was everything a woman could ask for, kind, reliable, the kind of man who'd drop everything to fix a leaky faucet or sit with me through a bad day. We'd built something together, a life stitched with shared dreams and quiet joys. But beneath that comfort, there was a distance I couldn't ignore, a slow fade in the spark that had once lit up our days. Marriage, I'd come to realize, wasn't the fairy tale I dreamed of as a girl. It wasn't a whirlwind of passion or a constant stream of bliss. It was work, beautiful, messy work. It was compromise, routine, the gradual blending of two lives into one. And somewhere along the way, between diaper changes and mortgage payments, Daniel and I had settled into a love that was steady but predictable, warm but no longer wild. I still loved him, I was sure of that, but it was a love that had grown soft around the edges, a little too comfortable for its own good. Ethan, though, he was different. There was a quiet intensity to him, a depth that pulled me in like a tide I couldn't resist. Our encounters stayed innocent at first. A quick smile at the next family barbecue, a brief chat while washing dishes at Thanksgiving. But each moment carried a charge, a hum of something unspoken that made my pulse quicken. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was projecting my own discontent onto a man who was just being friendly. Yet, as the weeks stretched into months, I found myself seeking him out, lingering a little longer when he was around, asking questions just to hear his voice. The first time we crossed the line, it wasn't planned. It was a crisp October night, the air sharp with the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. We were at my in-laws again, gathered for a cozy family dinner. The house was alive with chatter and the clatter of plates, but I needed a break, a moment to breathe. I slipped outside, the cold biting at my skin, and found Ethan on the porch, his silhouette framed against the star-strewn sky. "Couldn't handle the chaos either?" I asked, wrapping my arms around myself as I stepped closer. He chuckled, a soft sound that warmed the night. "Not tonight," too much noise in there. We fell into conversation as we always did, but this time there was a heaviness to it, a thread of vulnerability that hadn't been there before. I don't know what possessed me to say it. Maybe it was the wine, maybe it was the weight of everything I'd been carrying, but the words slipped out before I could stop them. I feel like I've been asleep, I confessed, staring at the ground. Like I'm just going through the motions, but I'm not really here. He didn't answer right away. He turned his gaze to the distance, his jaw tight, as if weighing his response. "I know what you mean," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I wonder if this is it, just existing, waiting for something more." His words sank into me, stirring something I'd buried deep. We stood there in silence, the space between us alive with everything we weren't saying. When he finally looked at me, his eyes held a storm of emotions, sadness, longing, a question neither of us dared to ask. In that moment, I knew we'd stepped too close to the edge, and there was no going back. The affair didn't explode into being all at once. It crept in slowly, a series of stolen moments that blurred the lines between right and wrong, a brush of hands as we passed in the hallway, a whispered conversation at a crowded party, a late-night text that started with "Are you awake?" and ended with words we couldn't take back. Each step felt like a choice, and yet I told myself I wasn't choosing, that I could stop any time, that I wasn't really breaking anything. But I was. The guilt grew heavier with every glance, every touch, every lie I told myself to keep going. I'd look at Daniel across the dinner table, his steady hands cutting chicken for the kids, his tired smile as he asked about my day, and feel like a stranger in my own skin. He deserved better than this, better than me. And yet, I couldn't pull myself away from Ethan, from the way he made me feel alive again. The end came as quietly as it had begun. It was a grey morning in the park near my house, the leaves crunching underfoot as Ethan and I met one last time. I'd rehearsed the words 100 times. I couldn't do this anymore. It wasn't fair to anyone. We had to stop. He nodded, his face a mask of resignation, and we parted ways with a handshake that felt absurdly formal after everything we'd shared. I thought ending it would bring relief, a clean slate to rebuild what I'd broken. But instead, it left me hollow, the weight of my secret pressing down like a stone. I knew I couldn't keep it from Daniel any longer, not if I wanted any chance at salvaging what was left of us. The confession came on a Sunday afternoon, the house bathed in the soft glow of late autumn. The kids were at a friend's house, and Daniel was sprawled on the couch with a book, his glasses slipping down his nose. It was a scene so familiar, so safe, that I almost turned back. But then he looked up at me, his eyes warm and trusting, and I knew I had to do it. "Daniel," I started, my voice shaking. "Can we talk?" He set the book down, a faint frown creasing his forehead. "Of course. What's wrong?" I sat across from him, my hands trembling in my lap, and let the truth spill out. I told him about the distance I'd felt, the loneliness that had driven me to Ethan, the affair that had grown from a spark into a fire I couldn't control. I didn't soften the edges or beg for forgiveness. I just laid it bare, my voice cracking as the words tumbled free. When I finished, the silence was suffocating. Daniel stared at me, his face a blank slate, his hands gripping the armrests of the chair. I could see the hurt in his eyes, the betrayal cutting deep. But he didn't shout or storm out. He just sat there, taking it in. "How long?" he asked at last, his voice rough. "Months," I whispered. "But it's over. I ended it, I swear." He held up a hand, cutting me off. "Stop. Just stop." The pain in his gaze shattered me. He stood and paced the room, his movements sharp and restless, then stopped and looked at me again. "I need time," he said, his voice tight. "I need to think." And then he walked away, leaving me alone with the wreckage of my choices. The days that followed were a blur of tension and silence. Daniel threw himself into work, coming home late and retreating to the guest room without a word. The space between us, once a gentle comfort, had become a gaping wound. I wanted to fix it, to beg, to plead, to promise I'd never hurt him again, but I didn't know where to start. One night, as I scrubbed the dishes in the kitchen, he appeared in the doorway, his arms crossed. "We need to talk," he said, his tone steady but firm. I nodded, drying my hands and following him to the dining table. We sat in silence for a moment, the air thick with everything unsaid, until he spoke. "I've been thinking about what you told me," he began, his eyes fixed on the table. "And I need to know, why? Why wasn't I enough?" Tears stung my eyes as I searched for an answer. "It wasn't about you," I said, my voice breaking. "It was me. I felt lost, like I'd forgotten who I was, and instead of turning to you, I ran the other way. I was wrong, Daniel. I was so wrong." He looked up at me, his expression softening just a fraction. "I'm not perfect," he said quietly. "I know I've been distant, too caught up in work and life, but I never thought we'd end up here." "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words feeling small against the enormity of my mistake. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I'll do anything to make this right." He didn't respond. Not then. He just nodded, a flicker of something. Hope, maybe? Crossing his face before he stood and left the room. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but it was a start. And for the first time in months, I felt a fragile thread of possibility weaving through the ruins of what we'd lost.